Welcome back to another video. I'm Tian, a product designer here based in Atlanta, Georgia. So a while back, I created a video where I did a critique of my old bootcamp project. Basically, I went through the file and I talked through some of the things that have changed over time in regards to how I approach design. So if that's something you're interested in, I'll leave a link in the description below or a card here somewhere that you can click on and check it out. This video is essentially a continuation of that. I'm going to go through my old case study and add some additional commentary on how this project would have been approached differently and probably written differently if we're in the context of being on a project or on a team or at a company or business. Before we dive right in, I want to address practicing design theoretically versus pragmatically and how there are always going to be differences. And what I mean by that is, if you're someone starting out in design or in the process of learning design, honestly, it makes sense to learn about the design thinking or double diamond process, whatever you're learning, in a very linear fashion, right? Because these are the steps that are going to get you to the eventual outcome. Essentially, when you're learning, a lot of the time you're learning about more execution than a lot of the, soft skills or in-betweens that are happening. But when you're learning these things in a course or a class, boot camp, whatever you want to call it, setting, all this stuff is still very theoretical. And that's why you'll constantly hear people say get real world experience or find some time to figure out a way to reach out to a client or someone where you're collaborating with people and other stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. And since we're going to go over my case study, that came from my bootcamp. If you look over it, it's very obviously written in a very linear way because that's the way that I learned it and that's the way that I was taught to approach it. But when we start talking about the practical application at each of these steps for a business, this is where the linearness doesn't really apply anymore. That's why I like to think about design or these things that I learn in a way more like guideposts along like a map or trail. So maps and trails can have different ways to get to a destination, or the way we like to think about it is like an outcome. Sometimes you stay at one place longer than another because you need to. Other times you'll skip a step or skip a guidepost because maybe it's not necessary. Maybe you know a shortcut, or maybe you're familiar with the route that you're taking. What it does help with though is when you're stuck or if you're lost or don't know what to do next, you can retrace your steps or rethink where you are and figure out what guideposts you need to go to make sure you get to where you need to go to. In this sense, design an outcome or a solution that fits the problem that you're given. So let's talk about how problems are presented. When you're starting out on a given project, the problem or the opportunity will set the tone of how you end up approaching it. So problems come in various shapes and forms, and boot camps tend to silo the types of problems to what I would like to label them as opportunities. So here are a few examples of how problems are usually discovered or presented. A product manager presents the problem to you, which I think is a very common way. You discover the problem on your own in the product, you're navigating through and you're like, oh, this is an issue. Let me do some research or discovery to figure out how big of the problem is. There's also, maybe there is a new bug or a feature request that comes down the pipeline from customer experience or sales because they have a highly important customer that needs this thing, or you have an angry customer that really needs this thing. Potentially, you could also have this platform that your company uses where you'll have feature upvoting and downvoting, and you could have a really highly requested feature, and then that will inform how your backlog gets filled. So again, these are just types of projects that you'd most interact with on a day-to-day or month-to-month basis, what you'll probably most commonly interact with through the day-to-day. Opportunities can still somewhat, be a problem, but they tend to look like, I would call them new product offerings, opportunities for you to holistically rethink or redesign a certain feature, or introducing a new user base to your product. So essentially something a little bit more new. And these tend to be larger projects that require more resources and time. So usually this is where bootcamp projects tend to explore and encompass. And a lot of case studies for boot camps tend to focus on basically designing a whole new app, or at least an MVP of a product, which is essentially like a whole new business in a lot of ways. So if you look at the case study that I have, which is essentially this hi-hat case study, it's a whole new app or product offering that, like, if I wanted to, I could try and start a business behind it, but I'm not gonna do that. Okay, so you're given the problem. Now you gotta do the digging on all the facets of the problems. In a linear fashion, you probably do your like user research, competitive analysis, create some personas, etc., yada yada. I'd say stop there, because these are really dependent on what information and resources you have at your disposal and how much time you have for the project. So there are various different ways to approach your user research. So how comprehensive you get with research and the type of research is going to depend on, again, the context. First, the type of data that you're going to get is either going to be quantitative or qualitative. So quantitative is more numbers driven, in tools like FullStory, Hotjar, Pendo, Google Analytics, Looker, etc., are some of the examples you work with that are tools that you work with that are usually in the background of the product that you're working on, and they're, you know, tracking and figuring out how people are interacting with your product. More data driven, you may not really know the why though. Qualitative methods like user interviews, ethnographies, etc., where you're really communicating and talking with users, or, you know, these other methods, this information you gain a better understanding of like people's backgrounds, how they work and their experience, and a better understanding like how and the why of how they use your product. You're generally going to have more direct, again, dialogue with the people to get a better understanding of their problems, the things that they're running into, maybe surfacing unique insights or higher level patterns. And again, just a better comprehension of the overall problem space when you directly talk, when you're usually doing more like this qualitative stuff. Then there are methods to help understand the current marketplace, such as SWOT analyses or, you know, competitive analyses. You know, essentially I find these very helpful to get a better understanding of the general makeup of the marketplace, so you understand how your product fits into this greater scheme of the industry. There's a really good chance that you'll audit the products and competitors out there and see how their products work. So you'll study their designs, the features, and the interactions. You know, you'll read help documentation and save screenshots of interfaces, save looms of interactions and flows that you find interesting. Essentially, you're getting an understanding of how their products work, but also how products work in the industry space, but also, another also here, to add, you're getting a better understanding of how you can improve on your work as well. It's not just, oh, because they're doing it, we're gonna do it. Ideally, in a happy world, you're taking a lot of what's out there for inspiration to figure out how you can build it into the current context that you're building for and how you can improve upon it as well. And lastly, we have personas. I've changed my perspective on how I think personas since my bootcamp days. So what I've done is I've started to think about these more like user archetypes or customer segments. Demographics, in a lot of ways, play a tinier role in this than you would think, especially if you aren't directly designing for like consumer-facing software. And trust me, there's a lot of B2B software out there at work to be done. What matters more is the type of roles your customers have and what goals they want to accomplish. So when they are using your technology or your software, what are the mental models and how do you design experiences that address those expectations? We're not necessarily focused on, you know, Mary, a mom who might buy brands like Apple and West Elm. We're more focused on Mary, and if she is a mom, how does her role in her life impact the way she does things and accomplishes things with software, especially if the software is targeted towards moms, you know, aiming to create a product to improve their lives in some way, fashion, or form. So again, if you're working at a company, the customer segments already tend to be defined or established, and those usually give you a baseline of the user types that you're going to be working with and interacting with and building for. Because, you know, these are the people who are already using your product, or potentially there could be a new user group that you'd want to, you know, introduce to your product. I want to make something really clear. All the things that I've previously mentioned and talked about, they could all be happening all at the same time. You could be doing user interviews for 2 weeks while also doing product research of what's out there on the market. You could have theories on your user types, but then that gets informed based on your user research. And while all that's happening, you could also be ideating and thinking about user flows, customer journey, and building out those simultaneously. You could also hypothetically be building out high fidelity wireframes while you're still technically doing user research, depending on the project and what's going on and what information you need. And as information is presented to me throughout the timeline of a project, I'm using that to help me understand what I need to do next. So information that I get yesterday can help me inform my next morning. Maybe I do some crazy eights because it sparked an idea. Or maybe I'm halfway through some high fidelity wireframes and then I get stuck on a part. So I go all the way back to like low fidelity wireframing or sketching. These are just some examples to show how these steps or methods are less linear and, again, depend more on context. Depending on how long the project is will determine how much time I will have for each of these things and how I include that in the process. So if I don't have time for user interviews, maybe I'm going to rely on the data resources or past interviews I've been in or other product knowledge that has been shared across the teams that I work with. For something that's a little bit more complicated, I will usually have some type of like user flow that I will create in like FigJam or something, just something so that I can make sure that I have a high level understanding of the logic and make sure that the way I'm understanding the problem makes sense. And a lot of times if I have like various different solutions, I'll use, again, user flows to map out each of the solutions to see which one is the best, and I'll share it with my design team or I'll share it with my product manager, again, to kind of check to see if I understand the problem. And you know, this can be done in like squares or low fidelity screens with arrows. Really, it's honestly not about how it looked versus the thing, me doing this, did it help me process information, and did this information help me move on to the next step or help me move forward in the process? So while all this is simultaneously happening, there are conversations between product managers, engineers, and other designers that are happening all behind the scenes. So I'll have feedback sessions with other designers. I'll share flows and ideas with product managers to make sure we're on the same page, to also make sure that we're on the same wavelength in regards to how we're addressing the problem. I'll also talk to engineers to try and understand how the technology works and whether or not the ideas and solutions we have are technically feasible. So one of the things that I want to note is that this project that I did, Hi-Hat, the scope is very, very large. And at the end of the day, if this was a new product or feature we wanted to release to like a bit like within a business, we would need to prioritize which pieces we need to create as the MVP. So in this case, I would say finding a restaurant would most likely be the core flow that I would push to focus on. And even then, there is some complexity here as well in like regards to like the interactions and some other things that we may need to pare down even more, just depending on time and scope of the project. And we may not be able to push it in the first round of development, but that's what product design is. You push out what you can and then you continue to iterate on it. The branding piece in this case study, that's not something I'd be determining for a business or company unless I'm the only designer on a team and nothing has been decided. Usually branding is contained to the marketing team and you work in collaboration with marketing on that. So what we as designers or product designers working on the product, what we're usually doing is we're trying to figure out ways to incorporate branding into the product. And one of those ways is you can take pieces like maybe typography and color and these other ways and incorporate them into the product, into the design system that you're working with. I don't design logos, that's not something I do. And a lot of the time the color palettes extend from the brand, but then there's also a lot of the time the colors that you do work with, they have a very functional reason. So like system status, graphs, data visualization is another example of how colors are used that could be branding, could not be branding. again, it would be that collaboration between marketing designers and product designers. And lastly, of course, we have user testing that's also probably simultaneously happening. Again, I'm going to continue iterating that this isn't a linear thing. This is just, things don't always go in a straight line here. Maybe I have a first pass on a design that I finally put together. I'll put the prototype in Maze, and then I'll send out the link to Maze to people to test it out. Or I'll hop on a call with a client who fits the user type we're targeting to see, how they receive it. I might even have a much higher level concept or a concept car of something that may not necessarily get developed, but it's an idea of something, and I'll share it with a user or customer to get feedback and their general reaction to the idea, to make sure that, like, oh, if their feedback is positive, maybe we are going in the right direction. If their feedback is not positive, why is it not positive, and what are ways that we can improve on that? A lot of the times we'll do internal testing due to the ease of access of people and how they tend to be a lot more responsive. So that also just depends on the type of user types and customer base you're working with, and how available they are to you sometimes. So for example, if you're working on a consumer-facing app, it's really easy to just go out into the world and be like, test my mobile device or my mobile app, because your general audience is kind of like almost everyone. But a lot of B2B software that you're working on, or in a lot of cases, that's not always going to be the case, where you can kind of just like give your test to someone and it's going to test in the way that you want it to. So ideally, what you want are the people who are intended to use your product test your product. So for example, let's say you're creating a product or digital experiences for construction workers. You'll most likely want to have construction workers test your product, and there may be some usability catches you might be able to gain from, again, sending it to a general audience. But remember, context. For example, like the mental model of the product is designed around construction workers, and not everyone will have the empathy or honestly the know-how of the terminology and processes that a construction worker goes through. So if someone in a general audience who's not a construction worker takes it, again, they might not understand what's going on, and then your test becomes skewed, because if you give it to not construction work people and then they're taking it, your results could be like really bad, but again, they're not construction workers, so something to consider. And then of course, lastly, there's a whole process of getting projects ready for the handoff phase and bringing it down to workable pieces, which gets into more to that like file organization that I was previously talking about in my previous video that I mentioned. Again, links in the description card somewhere, you can check it out. So at the end of all of this, the goal of a case study is to tell the story of how a problem was approached, and then the outcome of the problem. Sometimes you get pretty solutions, other times with all the different ups and downs that can happen, who knows. When it comes to any type of problem you face in design, you want to show progression, even if things don't go the way you think they would or should go. And what I mean by progression is that the things that you do, they should have reasoning and intention. So, you could move forward in your project, but then have a setback. How did you learn from the setback? And then how did you move forward from that? Ideally, there should always be a reason why you did something. The artifacts or the things that you essentially used throughout your project that you've created and then you put into your case studies, you shouldn't just make them to make them just to have them. They aren't just there because you needed to do them and then define that you did a method, right? There should always be a reason for why you did it, because it helped you with planning, it helped you with logic, it helped you with mapping out something, it helped you see a certain information, it helped you see a high level pattern, it helped you essentially do something so that you can move forward with your project. Anyway, thank you for taking the time to watch this. I feel like this was a long one, so if you stuck it out to this long, I appreciate, again, you taking the time. I hope this was helpful, and I hope this helped to see how process and approaches change over time, and how theoretical design adjust in practical situations. So let me know if there's anything that stood out to you, or if you have any questions about anything, you can leave them in the comments below. I've also included a link to this case study in the description below if you're interested in the details. But yeah, till then, I will catch you in the next one.